passed away from severe, yet fairly common illnesses. Vladimir Lenin succumbed to atherosclerosis, and Stalin to a cerebral hemorrhage. Konstantin Chernenko's health was compromised by asthma. These were the official diagnoses. These were the official accounts of the Kremlin leaders' deaths. Only a select few insiders knew that the death of the Soviet leaders was the result of the use of an ideal murder weapon created in the USSR, namely lethal poisons.
These toxins were produced here in Moscow, and they were created by the top experts of the NKVD's secret laboratory. Their task was to develop a potent method for neutralizing the adversaries of the Soviet Union. However, the ideologists and founders of the secret laboratory had no idea that this weapon would soon turn against them too.
For the first time, the actual causes of death of Soviet leaders. Lenin developed a fondness for mushroom soup.
Today it is suggested that the toxicity of the Cortinarius cyaosissimus mushroom is in question. This is a poisonous mushroom that could potentially lead to fatal consequences.
And Gorky died from his love of sweets. A new position at the Kremlin, a food taster for Stalin. Why didn't the leader eat the food at his own banquets?
It was not merely a case of poisoning. It was a horrific contamination of all bodily systems. The hemorrhage was so intense that upon opening the stomach, it appeared as though it had been riddled with bullets.
The perfect weapon from the NKVD's secret laboratory. The deaths of CEOs due to heart attacks are actually the outcomes of extremely potent poisons. (1924), all of Moscow bids farewell to Lenin. Despite the freezing cold, people endure long hours in line to approach the red coffin containing the body of the leader.
The official cause of Lenin's death will be declared as atherosclerosis of blood vessels due to their premature aging. But immediately after the funeral, rumors will begin to circulate throughout the capital, suggesting that the beloved leader's death was not as straightforward as it seems. The most daring will even speculate. Lenin was poisoned.
Lenin's personal physician, Fyodor Gettier, was the first to harbor suspicions. He even refused to sign the report on the leader's death. He referred to the inaccuracies of the autopsy. The autopsy of Lenin's body commenced with a considerable delay. 16 hours and 20 minutes after his death was declared. For some reason, pathologists did not perform a chemical analysis of the deceased's stomach contents, even though the stomach walls were completely destroyed. They were destroyed by an unidentified substance, probably a potent poison. But why poison a frail old man who didn't have much time left anyway? Who was bothered by the dying Lenin? He could barely move and talk, but he was alive. And Stalin realized that regardless of how severe Lenin's illness was, as long as Lenin was alive, he was the nominal leader. He, not Stalin. Watch without commercial interruptions. What poison was used to assassinate Vladimir Lenin, and how did his favorite mushroom soup contribute to the leader's demise? A poisoned cake for psychiatrist Bekhterev. Stalin's retaliation for the diagnosis of paranoia. By Stalin's decree, a mausoleum will be specifically constructed for the interment of the first Soviet leader. 56 days after Ilyich's death, the Bolsheviks decided to embalm his body. Then additional evidence of Lenin's poisoning will emerge. During the embalming process, lethal toxins, amanitin and phalloidin, were discovered in the roots of the deceased leader's hair. Researchers claim that these toxins are found in poisonous mushrooms. It was well known in the Kremlin that Lenin was a passionate mushroom forager and often requested mushroom soup for dinner, which he prepared and dried with his own hands. But a couple of weeks before his death, he was served a soup that contained completely different mushrooms.
Here it is, the deadly mushroom Cortinarius chiosimus. His poison doesn't kill instantly, but gradually over a span of 2 weeks. Once introduced into the human body, this toxin paralyzes the body's motor functions and induces respiratory distress. Such symptoms were observed in Lenin during the last days of his life.
The inner circle of the leader never discovered that the lethal mushroom came from a secret poison laboratory established by Lenin himself. But why was there a need for such a laboratory?
The truth is that every country has such laboratories. This can be justified by the fact that national security is tied to this field. Lenin believed that the Soviet government had numerous adversaries who could be eliminated without drawing attention. That is, to make their deaths appear natural, diagnosable as, for example, a heart attack, or as some kind of chronic illness.
Soviet chemists and microbiologists experimented with a wide range of substances, from traditional plant toxins to the most recent chemical compounds. The results of these experiments will soon become evident when a series of strange and mysterious deaths occur in the USSR. In 1936, a gift from the Kremlin, a box of chocolates, was delivered to the town of Gorky near Moscow, where the writer Maxim Gorky resided and received treatment. The author sampled the Kremlin's hospitality. The following day, he passed away.
On June 19, 1936, the Pravda newspaper reported unfortunate news. The Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR announced with profound sorrow the passing of a true friend of the working class and a champion for the triumph of communism, Comrade Alexei Maximovich Gorky. Among the many eulogies, not a single word was mentioned about the cause of his death.
Gorky's body will be cremated and interred in the Kremlin wall. Comrade Stalin will personally carry the urn with the ashes. There's no doubt that the eminent proletarian writer's death marked his end. But why kill the storm petrel of the revolution?
The reality is that during those years, a significant conflict was anticipated between Gorky and Stalin. He could not reconcile with the repressions that were imposed, including on his closest friends. It is known that Lev Borisovich Kamenev was Gorky's deputy at the Academy Publishing House. Kamenev was among the first to suffer. He was executed in the 34th year.
And Gorky began corresponding with Louis Aragon, Romain Rolland, André Gide, that is, with prominent and well-respected communist writers who held high esteem in the West. He invited them to the Soviet Union to share their impressions.
What could Stalin have done in this situation? It's impossible to arrest and execute a world-renowned author. However, it can be discreetly eliminated without shedding a single drop of blood using a potent poison.
Stalin carried out his plans through his assistant, the head of the NKVD and his loyal executioner, Genrikh Yagoda. He was the one who brought Gorky candies laced with deadly poison. The omnipotent chief of Stalin's secret police, Heinrich Yagoda, had known the writer since childhood. the future voice of the revolution, and the chief Soviet secret police officer were neighbors in Nizhny Novgorod. Then Gorky called young Henry Berry. They met many years later in Moscow. Gorky had already become a globally renowned writer, and Yagidka had become the foremost executioner of the Great Terror era. Under his direct leadership, the Gulag was established. Moreover, he became the inaugural overseer of the poison laboratory. On Stalin's orders, he will eliminate his compatriot and former neighbor, Maxim Gorky. However, the demise of the author will also be a judgment for him. Stalin, having planned to assassinate Gorky, intended to deliver a double blow, to the victim and to his poisoner. 1938. 2 months after Gorky's death, the show trial of Heinrich Jagoda began in the October Hall of the House of Unions. The main accusations: the assassination of Gorky, the murder of Politburo member of the Central Committee Kirov, and espionage. Jagoda will be sentenced to death. Stalin appointed Mykola Yezhov to the vacant position of the chief Soviet executioner. He will surpass his predecessor in many aspects. Nearly 800,000 people will be affected by his orders. Yezhov won't even spare his own wife. He will kill her with lewisite, a poison from a secret laboratory. According to one theory, it was due to constant betrayals, while another suggests it was because the woman interfered with his homosexual relationship. Due to his exceptional cruelty and short stature, Yezhov was referred to as the Bloody Dwarf. He held his position for only 2 years, until his place was taken by a powerful competitor, a man named Lavrenti Beria. Watch without commercial interruptions. The brutal special operation of Nikolai Yezhov's successor. Why did Stalin appoint Beria as the head of the NKVD? Mysterious disappearances of hundreds of Moscow residents. Examining the effects of toxins on humans under controlled conditions. Academician Vladimir Bekhterev rushed to the Kremlin. Comrade Stalin himself required the consultation of a renowned psychiatrist. The scientist spent more than an hour alone with the leader. Due to this visit, he was significantly late for the All-Union Congress of Psychiatrists and Neurologists. And when he finally arrived, he nervously answered his colleagues' questions.
I was at the Kremlin to observe a paranoid person with a withered hand.
The only person in the Kremlin who had such power was Stalin.
In photographs and newsreel footage, one of Stalin's arms is always slightly bent. More often than not, the Secretary General carries a briefcase in his hand, and sometimes hides it behind the hem of his coat or behind his back. In this way, Stalin conceals his left hand, which was crippled in his childhood. When Stalin was 10 years old, he was hit by a phaeton. Due to the injury, the left arm started to become infected, later atrophied, and eventually became 4 centimeters shorter than the right.
It is unclear what impacted the leader more in Bekhterev's words, the reference to his crippled hand or the assertion of mental deviation. However, when these words were relayed to the leader, the academician's fate was sealed. That evening, the Mali Theater was staging the play Lyubov Yarova. Bekhterev also came to watch the performance. During the break, the academic went to the cafeteria. There he spoke to a curious young man with a Georgian accent. He drank juice and ate a cake. When he arrived home, he felt unwell and passed away a few hours later. According to the official account, he was poisoned by canned food.
It remains unclear why it was canned food. After all, representatives from the health department did not perform a pathological examination and did not investigate the stomach contents. They only extracted the scientist's brain for experiments. The body was hastily cremated, allegedly per Bekhtyrev's own wishes, although his relatives insisted on a burial.
After a successful operation to treat Bekhtyrev's disease, Beria will be promoted. Stalin will appoint him as the director of a secret laboratory. Under Beria's leadership, this covert unit will transform into a potent poison factory. The chief assistant to the head of the NKVD will be the talented chemist and physician, Grigory Marinovsky. Grigory Marinovsky was later referred to as the Soviet Dr. Death. Beria will assign him the task of creating a perfect poison that leaves no traces during an autopsy. And for this, he will provide Dr. Marinovsky with a unique opportunity to conduct experiments on human subjects.
In a particular letter, later penned by the Prosecutor General of the USSR, Rudenko, and the head of the KGB, Semihasny, it was stated that these individuals were either unjustly sentenced to death or were people who had been abducted off the streets. Such a phrase exists. This is a very significant and important document in the history of Marinovsky, but ultimately also in the history of the system that was created under Beria and his associates.
Muscovites avoided this alley in the city center in the 1930s. Until 1917, the Varsinofievsky Monastery was situated here, later becoming the headquarters and torture chambers of the NKVD. This was where the clandestine lab for producing poison was situated. Their covert experiments were conducted using makeshift resources, namely local prisoners.
The man gasped for air, started to choke, his lips turned blue, his body convulsed, and then went limp. His eyes rolled. Throughout this period, the subject is closely observed by the medical committee led by Marinovsky. The assistant meticulously documents the process of death. This is one of Marinovsky's initial experiments. An experiment involving mustard gas was conducted. Subsequently, he began to investigate the effects of arsenic, potassium cyanide, and mercury. Then the study moved on to thallium, hydrocyanic acid, and curare. Marinovsky mixed, combined, and altered the dosage of poisons. He administered them through injections, applied them on the skin, and incorporated them into the food of his subjects. He tested each option on 10 test subjects, and in the end, he managed to achieve the desired result. A person poisoned died instantly and peacefully. However, the most crucial aspect remained, that is, to attain a result in which no doctor could ascertain the true cause of death.
This is the Sklifosovsky Institute in Moscow. This is where a secret cargo was delivered twice a week from Varsinofievsky Lane. The car arrived late at night. The paramedics left the institute and transported the bodies for examination by pathologists. But each time they received a disappointing response. During the autopsy, poison was detected in the bodies of the deceased.
It will be several months before the doctors finally make another diagnosis.
The cause of death is acute heart failure.
It was a huge success. After extensive experiments, doctors were able to develop a poison that was perfectly suited for the operations of Chekist agents. This toxin was labeled as K2. This is a chemical compound called choline chloride. The toxic solution or powder could be added to food. The result exceeded all expectations. 15 minutes later, the man died of cardiac arrest. Beria rushed to inform Stalin about the accomplishments of the laboratory scientists.
In nearly 100% of cases, pathologists declared heart attack, heart attack, heart attack. When this experiment was conducted on numerous individuals, it became evident that the toxin could be utilized in tactical operations. Consequently, they began to implement such operations on others.
What occurred following the discovery of this poison could be viewed as a coincidence or a fatal accident. However, the fact remains. All the representatives of Lenin's old guard, whom Stalin despised and feared so much, turned out to be cardiac patients. Of course, it became evident after the sudden demise of each one of them.
In 1933, while on the way to Spain, Commissar Lunacharsky suffered from heart failure. In 1935, Slutsky, the chief of foreign intelligence for the NKVD, passed away in Lubyanka after consuming tea and biscuits. The diagnosis was an acute heart attack. In 1937, Orjonikidze died of a heart attack. And finally, in 1938, Kuibyshev, a member of the Central Committee, died from heart sclerosis.
And this is despite the fact that they were all quite young for such age-related diagnoses. Lunacharsky was 58 years old, Orjonikidze was 51, Kuibyshev was 45, and Abram Slutsky was only 40. The laboratory continues to operate, assisting the leader in methodically eliminating the undeserving. However, the greater the success of this laboratory, the more it terrifies Stalin. Gradually, an almost primal fear takes hold in the soul of the General Secretary. Fear of being poisoned.
Contrary to the common belief that the leader had simple tastes, Stalin still enjoyed eating well. He preferred fish dishes, primarily Danube herring and smoked shamaya. He selected tomatoes and eggplants as vegetables, but he seldom consumed meat. Stalin did not like canned food at all. He was very fond of jam made from unripe nuts, which his mother used to send him. Every dish served to the Secretary General was accompanied by a report from a special committee. No toxic substances were detected.
The Secretary General has established an incredibly rigorous product control system. He received water from Abkhazia, and wine was shipped directly from Georgia via a special route. Even such improved security measures often failed to satisfy Stalin.
His bodyguard stated that once a batch of wine was delivered to him from Georgia, and he commanded it to be disposed of. They say that when he was given a prescription, that is, when a doctor prescribed him medication, like aspirin or something else, he would hand the prescription to the guard and say, "Go, there's a village pharmacy nearby, buy it there." And Stalin simply discarded the medicine prescribed by the doctor.
This was the case in all situations. Even at the renowned Stalinist banquets, when the guests sat down for dinner, the General Secretary was always the last one to begin eating. Using various excuses, he compelled his fellow party members to try every dish without exception. He waited for a while before he started eating. Who was Stalin so afraid of? It was his aide and faithful associate, Lavrenti Beria. The more powerful and influential the NKVD chief became, the greater the threat he posed to the General Secretary. Eventually, Stalin decides to eliminate Beria, after which he initiates one of the final purges, the Mingrelian affair. The objective was to eliminate those who were close to Beria. There was even a rhyme circulating around Moscow at that time. Our comrade Beria is no longer trusted. Soon, the General Secretary will strike another blow against Beria. He will arrest the chief Soviet poisoner, Grigory Marinovsky. The director of the toxicology laboratory is accused of unlawful storage of hazardous substances. The Soviet Doctor of Death was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Marinovsky decided to defend himself and began writing letters to the authorities, asserting his innocence. After all, he carried out all these experiments under the personal directives of Comrade Beria, and naturally, who would have thought that he could do it himself? Indeed, he did nothing.
What about Beria? He didn't assist his former protege. The influential commissar took care of his own life. Lavrenti Beria knew his leader all too well and understood that Stalin would not forgive him, so he prepared for conflict. Beria understood that to save himself, he needed to make the first move. And he did it. Stay tuned for the program. Sensational details about Joseph Stalin's death. The General Secretary was assassinated using poison from the NKVD's secret laboratory, and it was dispatched on the orders of Lavrenti Beria. Weak leaders in power. Konstantin Chernenko was allegedly poisoned a few days before his pivotal appointment. On March 5, 1953, Stalin was found lying on the floor of his dacha in Kuntsevo. Helpless, exhausted, he could not even call for help. Meanwhile, several people were patiently waiting outside the door for his demise. These were the closest associates of the Secretary General. Lavrenti Beria was among them. Finally, a woman entered the room. She gave him an injection. A few hours later, Stalin passed away. The official cause of his death was a cerebral hemorrhage. Indeed, according to experts, it was a typical case of poisoning. Stalin's worst fears were confirmed. He was assassinated by poison from a covert laboratory, a poison administered under the command of Lavrenti Beria.
Beria himself will soon repeat the fate of Stalin. He will be executed under the orders of Nikita Khrushchev. However, they will employ a more conventional method. They will execute him in the Lubyanka torture chambers. But the saga of the Kremlin's poisonings will not end there. The poison lab will continue its operations under new ownership.
Continue watching without commercial interruptions. Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera and Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov are the upcoming subjects of the poison laboratory. Soviet method of assassination in the renowned French comedy Le Coup du Parapluie, the Umbrella Coup. In October 1959, a young man walked into the entrance of a house at Kreitmayerstrasse 7 in Munich. In his hand, he holds a rolled-up newspaper. In a few minutes, an elderly man will enter the house carrying a bag of tomatoes. As soon as he closes the door behind him, a barely audible sound will be heard. A stream of toxic liquid splashed onto the man's face. He fell and never got up. This is how Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was assassinated. The sentence was executed by the professional Soviet assassin Bohdan Stashinsky.
This miniature pistol is no bigger than a fountain pen. It is filled with vials of poison. Today, any bottle of eau de toilette functions in this way, but back then it was a technological novelty. You press the button and a toxic aerosol disperses. The gun used by Stepan Bandera's assassin was loaded with potassium cyanide.
This poison has neither color nor odor. The poison takes effect immediately and rapidly dissipates from the body. At that time, the Soviet poison laboratory already had substances for any situation. Some poisons cause quick and painless death, while others result in a lengthy and unbearable demise. Some toxins enter the body through food, others through the air, clothing, or simply by touching an object.
These were not only toxins, by the way, but also substances that can incapacitate a person for a while. For instance, substances that can allow people to work for extended periods despite exhaustion. In other words, these are also drugs that induce talkativeness, commonly known as truth serums. The concept was to create a drug that would eliminate the need to torture a prisoner. Instead, you would simply give him this pill. He would take it and instantly reveal everything, immediately disclose all information. So it was such an attractive idea.
In 1981, the French comedy The Umbrella Coup, starring Pierre Richard, was released on Soviet screens. The movie about a tall, clumsy blonde became the box office hit in the Soviet Union. However, few people knew at the time that the comedy was based on the true story of a murder. In 1978, dissident and BBC employee Georgy Markov was poisoned in London. Walking through a crowd of people, he tripped over someone's umbrella and passed away 3 days later. KGB agents used a poison-tipped umbrella for the assassination.
A poisoned umbrella is the most sophisticated method of public assassination. A shooting mechanism is integrated into the tip of the umbrella. The device ejects poisonous ampules. The remnants of such a capsule were discovered in the leg of the deceased Markov.
The umbrella released ricin. It is an extremely potent poison, 80 times stronger than potassium cyanide, and it is also inexpensive. The product is derived from the waste cake of castor oil production. The victim is destined for a slow and painful death. Initially, the individual's eyes become red, blisters appear on the skin, the body temperature increases, and convulsions start. Ricin has no antidote. Doctors can only alleviate the symptoms of the afflicted.
There were, presumably, many other poisonings for which there is no proof. The documents might not even exist, given that many documents are highly sensitive. The highest level of confidentiality that existed in the Soviet Union was the so-called special file. It was a singular copy, and virtually no one had access to this folder, except for the executors and members of the Politburo.
Who ordered these mysterious killings? At that time, the KGB was led by Andropov. He coordinated operations with Leonid Brezhnev. However, in reality, the frail, exhausted General Secretary dreamt of only one thing: to resign, but it did not come to fruition. On July 17, 1978, the youngest member of Brezhnev's Politburo, Fyodor Kulakov, passed away at his dacha in the Moscow region. The following day, ITAR TASS reported that the cause of death was acute heart failure due to sudden cardiac arrest. Kulakov's death will become one of the most enigmatic events of the Brezhnev era. He was only 60. Moreover, Kulakov never complained about his heart. Immediately following his demise, peculiar rumors started circulating within the party. Incredibly, just before this event, Leonid Brezhnev, who was barely kept alive by doctors after a near-death experience, was preparing to resign and had even named his potential successor, Fyodor Kulakov. Ultimately, Brezhnev was not permitted to resign. His inner circle convinced him to remain in office. And shortly after that, his protege, Fyodor Kulakov, suddenly died. But why? Here's what Kazanachev, the former secretary of the Stavropol Regional Committee of the party, has written on the matter. That evening, for reasons unknown, his bodyguards and personal physician, who were assigned to each member of the Politburo, left Kulakov's dacha. And by morning, his wife found him dead. By a strange coincidence, young Kulakov also happened to have a heart disease. Kulakov's position as the secretary of the Central Committee will be succeeded by his compatriot, Mikhail Gorbachev. This will be the first step towards the Kremlin Olympus for the secretary of the Provincial City Committee. But who was the benevolent angel who helped him ascend to the pinnacle of power? The omnipotent KGB chief, Yuri Andropov. He led the world's most powerful intelligence service for 15 years, but for 7 of those years, he was entirely in control of the country, single-handedly making decisions that the ailing Secretary General was no longer capable of. For instance, he was the one who convinced Brezhnev to sign the order to deploy troops to Afghanistan. And he was the one who would become the sole leader of the USSR after the death of Leonid Ilyich. However, Andropov will only govern the country for 15 months. The history of the illness of the omnipotent head of the KGB was one of the greatest secrets of the Soviet Union. Andropov suffered from chronic kidney failure. The situation was exacerbated by the Asian flu contracted in Afghanistan. He was kept alive with the help of potent medications. Andropov governed the country from a hospital bed. He knew he wouldn't last long and was preparing his successor. However, it was Mikhail Gorbachev, not Konstantin Chernenko, who took over the country after Andropov's death. But then why isn't he, but rather Chernenko, who will become the next Secretary General? Konstantin Chernenko was a protege of Brezhnev. He was widely recognized and backed within the Central Committee. But Gorbachev was a new kind of leader. Andropov's protege worked as the secretary of the Stavropol Regional Committee of the CPSU until 1978, and he was elected a member of the Politburo in Moscow just 4 years prior to the death of the former KGB head. Thus, Gorbachev simply could not rival Chernenko in terms of influence and significance within the party. But as it turned out, there was no need for this. At Andropov's funeral, it will become clear to the entire country that the next Secretary General will also not have a long tenure. Konstantin Chernenko can barely read a short eulogy. He will slouch, mumble his words, blow his nose. Only his inner circle will understand why the formerly robust old man has become a wreck. This is what 73-year-old Chernenko looked like just 6 months ago. He vacationed with his family in Crimea. He felt great and swam effortlessly beyond the buoys. Once, Vitaly Fedorchuk, the Minister of Internal Affairs of the USSR, paid him a visit. He stayed nearby in a government sanatorium. Fedorchuk suggested trying smoked fish. Chernenko savored the delicacy with pleasure. And at night, he was awakened by unbearable stomach pain. He was urgently transferred to Moscow in a very critical condition. Doctors reported that the cause of severe poisoning was spoiled fish.
However, the entire family ate the fish, but only Chernenko got poisoned. And here is the result: severe toxic infection with complications manifesting as heart and lung failure. Doctors literally pulled the future General Secretary back from the brink of death, but they could not restore his health. Chernenko was already incapacitated.
But why did the dish brought by Fedorchuk pass the traditional inspection? What toxic substances could have been present in the smoked fish that Chernenko tasted?
The truth is that from a young age, Konstantin Ustinovich suffered from a severe condition, bronchial asthma. He had an allergic variant of the disease, primarily impacting the respiratory system. In the context of chronic bronchial asthma, individuals suffering from it can develop an even more severe lung-related condition, specifically pulmonary emphysema. You know, any infection, even a minor one, like a foodborne illness or a respiratory infection, could be lethal for such a severely ill person. And then, Kostiantin Ustinovich was indeed fortunate to have survived the poisoning at all.
Many years later, in his book Health and Power, Yevhen Chasov, the Kremlin's chief physician, would write about how he reported to Secretary General Andropov after examining Chernenko. Andropov was just about to go on holiday. In his absence, Chernenko always stayed on duty in the country. After calmly listening to the news of the horrific poisoning, Andropov said, "I can't do anything to help him." And Gorbachev will stay in the Central Committee, who is knowledgeable about all issues and will handle the work calmly. Andropov will pass away 2 months later. His position will be assumed by the still living but frail Chernenko. He will govern the country for only 13 months. After the death of the General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. It will conclude the era of the Soviet Union with its secrets and poisonings. Some information from the archives stored in Lubyanka will be made public. However, these documents will not reveal anything about the fate of the secret laboratory, which for over 60 years catered to the political and personal needs of the USSR leaders.
Yes, of course, this laboratory existed. It's clear that it still exists, but for obvious reasons, nothing is known about it. We don't even know who took over after Maranovsky. That is, the laboratory was previously dissolved, but it may have simply been renamed and relocated to a different structure.
Documents on this subject are currently stored in the confidential archives of the FSB, and they contain classified information about toxins produced in Soviet specialized laboratories, the perfect weapon of the Kremlin leaders who became its most notorious victims.
They were poisoned, shot, and deliberately killed in road accidents. In the USSR, the attempted murders were suppressed. But that doesn't mean they didn't happen. Watch the attempts upon all the Soviet leaders, from Lenin to Gorbachev, in one program. The dethronement of the terrorist Fanny Kaplan's myth. Lenin was shot at by the Cheka agents on Sverdlov's order. For the first time, the real circumstances that led to the attempt upon Lenin's life. The famous Russian writer, the author of the bestseller Stalin's Murder. Yuri Mukin asserts Stalin was poisoned by Beria and Khrushchev. The People's Avengers, the Tbilisi students against Khrushchev, a fake policeman against Brezhnev, Andropov, an ascent over corpses and death at the hands of a woman. He has been shooting at Gorbachev. An exclusive interview from Krasnaya Square, where the event happened. The only time Soviet newspapers announced an attempt upon a state leader was when assassins tried to kill Lenin in August 1918. He was speaking to the workers of the Moscow factory of Mikhelson. Afterwards, on his way back to his car, the socialist revolutionary Fanny Kaplan shot at him. This was according to official reports. And this was the way it was presented in the Soviet propaganda film Lenin in 1918. The legend about an insidious social revolutionary's attempt on the life of the revolutionary leader lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fact that Fanny Kaplan was almost blind and had never shot a gun was classified as secret for many years. Eyewitnesses and even Lenin himself claimed to have seen a man shooting at him. When Lenin gained consciousness, he asked the driver, did they catch him?
Під час слідства
During the investigation, not one of the witnesses recognized Kaplan as the assassin. Kaplan didn't sign the examination records confessing that she had committed the crime. The truth is shocking. According to the investigation, which has recently been taken off the security list, it was not Kaplan who shot at Lenin, but her comrades from the Socialist Revolutionary Party, Grigory Semenov and Lydia Konopleva. It is strange that Kaplan was arrested and later executed for the crime. Semenov and Konopleva escaped punishment. In fact, their careers began to improve.
Их жизнь, как ни странно, сложилась по-другому. Они потом работали в системе ОГПУ и, по-моему, даже военной разведки Красной Армии, посылались в Китай.
Why? What unknown and mighty power was behind all this? Contemporary researchers assured that Semenov and Konopleva were the Cheka agents and that they executed the order of the most influential person from the Soviet government.
Это покушение очень часто связывали с именем Свердлова. Сложно сказать, насколько эта версия, что называется, правдоподобна. Но вот поводов для нее множество.
Yakov Sverdlov. He was leading the party at the time when everybody was criticizing Lenin for having signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. When all the party leaders were against the treaty with Germany and believed that Lenin had betrayed the revolution, his authority fell to become the leader of the Bolsheviks party. Moreover, he was head of Vitslik, the Central Executive Committee. It was an analogue of the present cabinet of ministers, and nominally it made him the head of the state. Lenin was the last physical obstacle for him to usurp power. But he had to hide his intention to end Lenin's power behind the insidious counter-revolutionary forces. To put the blame on the social revolutionaries, for example. That's why Cheka has recruited Semenova and Konopleva. And they have taken their fanatical party fellow Fanny Kaplan as a henchman with a view to leave her holding the bag. We are going to make a reconstruction of the real attempt upon Lenin on the basis of the circumstances that have been recently revealed. Before nightfall, Fanny Kaplan appeared in the yard of the Moscow factory of Michelson. She asked a worker whether it was true that Lenin had been speaking at the meeting in the grenade shop. The worker confirmed that it was true. Fanny recounted this to a messenger outside in the street. Kaplan did not return to the factory again. 10 minutes later, Semenov and Konopleva arrived. Each of them had a gun in his pocket. Lenin came out of the shop accompanied by factory workers. He was talking to one of them. There were a lot of people around him. And just at that moment, the Cheka agents began to shoot. An injured Lenin and his interlocutor fell to the ground. Terrified people began to scatter. The terrorists left the area. Fanny Kaplan was waiting in the next street. She wanted to know the outcome. Suddenly, a military man arrested her and took her to Lubyanka. The investigator demanded Kaplan take the blame and make a signed declaration. The interrogation lasted till 2 o'clock in the morning, but Kaplan repudiated all the incriminations and refused to sign the report. The next day, after the terrorism attack, the doctors announced that there was no threat to the leader's life. Sverdlov began to urgently cover his tracks. He was afraid that Kaplan would betray her accomplices. Having suspended the interrogations at Lubyanka, Sverdlov took Kaplan to the Kremlin and ordered the Kremlin commandant annihilate the prisoner immediately, in secrecy and without any traces.
Говорил комендант Кремля Мальков, ее, значит, так сказать, положили на пол и сделали в затылок выстрел. Да, а потом сожгли в бочке, просто на территории Кремля. Вот, собственно, никакого суда там не было.
No one knows whether Lenin knew the identity of the real assassins. But several months later, Yakov Sverdlov died under strange circumstances at the age of 34. The official version says that he died from Spanish flu. It is well known that this is a contagious disease. Yet no one who had contact with Sverdlov at that time fell ill with Spanish flu, including Lenin, who was not too daunted to say farewell to his dying comrade. The rumor that Sverdlov had been poisoned existed in the Kremlin even while Lenin was still alive. And these rumors were proved when Lenin ordered the creation of a top-secret poison. Maybe it was Sverdlov's example that gave Lenin evidence that his reprisal method worked.
Существовал отдел при ОГПУ, который занимался изготовлением всевозможных химических ядов, ну, там, скажем, и бактерий всевозможных, для того, чтобы с помощью них убивать врагов советской власти за рубежом или, так сказать, может быть, даже здесь, ну, самыми вот такими невинными способами, незаметными.
This was the beginning of the Soviet leaders' chase, and the principal danger was represented by the closest Kremlin comrades and not by the Western intelligence services or the mythical terrorists. They tried to swallow each other like spiders in a jar, and to enjoy absolute power after that. Coming next, the attempt that did not exist. Why did Beria feign an attack at Stalin? The first Ziz with the guard reached the other side of the bridge without any problems, but the bridge collapsed under another, in which Stalin was sitting. The poison laboratory is working perfectly. First Lenin and then Stalin became the victims of poisoning.
С этими ядами он, наверное, уже 1000 раз проклял, что соблазнился на то, чтобы их вот выработать там для целей войны, а они оказались вот такими для собственного употребления.
From 1922, Lenin fell ill and left the everyday running of the state. The poison laboratory was left to Stalin. Lenin's condition was seen as hopeless, and Stalin behaved as if Lenin was dead. But the patient did not die. Doctors were doing all they could, although he was in a vegetative state. Stalin became increasingly irritated. As long as Lenin was still alive, Stalin could not become head of state. He had to take action. The catastrophe happened on the morning of January the 21st, 1924. Lenin suddenly felt unwell. The cook, Gavril Volkov, asserted later that he had brought him breakfast, but the leader didn't eat it. He wrote a note to the cook in barely legible handwriting. Gavrilushka, I have been poisoned. Tell Nadia and Trotsky. Tell everybody. This fact was revealed for the first time by the writer Vladimir Solovyov in his book Operation Mausoleum. He was referring to the reminiscences of Leo Trotsky and the evidence of a Russian immigrant, Yelizaveta Lesotho, who asserted that she heard it in Moscow in 1924 from the cook Volkov himself. Soon after, he sent a note saying that Lenin had fainted. 1 hour 20 minutes later, he died in terrible pain. So Losif Stalin has finally come to power. He will govern the state for 30 years and remain in a state of panic for the entire time. Even while going from the Kremlin to his dacha, he dictates to the driver where he must turn. What if his comrades have placed snipers in his path? Stalin made only one error, but it was a fatal one. He had made his countryman Lavrenti Beria a close ally. It was 1933. Stalin was the sole leader in the USSR and went on holiday to Abkhazia, to the state of Dacha near the mountain lake Ritsa. The cars in his cortege were armored. The Guard was in the first car. Stalin was in the second. In the third were Beria and the People's Commissar for the Internal Affairs of Georgia. In the fourth were the domestics, and in the fifth was the Guard. Suddenly, Beria stopped the cavalcade and asked Stalin to move to the fourth car. The leader did what he was told. Beria joined him. The domestics moved to the second car. Stalin nervously asked why they'd changed places. Beria replied that he had had a sense of foreboding. They easily crossed one bridge, but on the second, something incredible happened. The first Ziz with the Guard reached the other side without any problems. But the bridge collapsed under the second car in which Stalin had been sitting. The Guards surrounded the fourth car where Stalin now sat and began to shoot in all directions. Because the car had stopped, it was a prime target for terrorists. But there were no terrorists near the bridge. Stalin didn't realize that the act of terrorism was just a show organized by Beria to show the father of the People's Republic how devoted and irreplaceable he was. The leader repaid his kindness. He took his rescuer to Moscow and nominated him the People's Commissar for the Internal Affairs of the USSR. But that was after the feigned act of terror that caused Stalin to fear for his life.
Сталин сам, в общем, измышлял покушение на себя очень часто. Да? И даже был подготовлен целый фильм еще в 1937 или 1938 году, один из первых советских сериалов, он, кстати, так на экраны и не вышел, о том, как Троцкий готовит покушение на Сталина. Ну, в действительности, Сталин подготовил покушение на Троцкого и, в общем-то, его и осуществил. Но именно Троцкого он боялся как возможного покусителя на себя.
But we have not succeeded in finding any evidence of an attempt on Stalin's life. His comrades were intimidated. The people were misled by the propaganda about the much-loved leader. Then there was a fearful war. And the great victory was attributed to Stalin using the same propaganda. He continued to fear for his life, with the memories of Beria's attempt causing him to remain suspicious. The famous Russian writer, the author of the book Murder of Stalin and Beria, Yuri Mukhin, was convinced that the last years of Stalin's life were full of fear for his own life.
Он подозревал о том, что что-то может быть. Подозревал он по поводу пищи. Охрана говорит, что однажды он приказал перебить, ему привезли вино с Грузии, он приказал его уничтожить. Что-то, какие-то соображения были. Вот вы ему приписывали лекарства, да, вот он рецепт и оставлял лечащий врач лекарства. Допустим, там аспирин или это самое. И вот он, говорит, брал этот рецепт, и охраннику говорит, едь, там рядом какая-то сельская аптека, купи в ней. А эти выбрасывал.
It was this weak point, Stalin's maniacal suspiciousness of his former rescuer, Lavrentiy Beria. During the late 40s, when the leader's health was in decline, Beria began to clear the way so that he could take over power. It was on the order of Beria that the chief of Stalin's guard, his personal secretary, the Kremlin commandant and the commandant of Stalin's dacha were arrested. Each of them was declared a betrayer and a counterintelligence agent by Beria. Later, he systematically destroyed all the guards and the doctors who had been in contact with Stalin. They were said to have planned an attempt upon the leader's life.
Глава охраны Сталина Власик, который, собственно, был ответственен за жизнь Иосифа Виссарионовича, неожиданно сам становится заключенным. Его самого подозревают, что якобы он что-то тоже хотел сделать против Сталина. Главный инициатор этого события, естественно, Берия. Берия устраивает дело врачей. Это дело приводит к тому, что люди, которые лечили Сталина раньше, теперь уже не могут этого делать. В общем, вот эти два важных края обороны в жизни Сталина, они как бы убираются.
Now, Beria was sure that nobody and nothing could save Stalin. The trap has closed. Watch after the break. Stalin dies a violent death, poisoned by a woman.
И она вызвала сына Сталина. Уже Василий туда кричал: «Отравили отца, сволочь».
A grenade for the General Secretary. What were the Tbilisi students avenging Khrushchev for? A fake or undercover policeman shoots at Brezhnev but hits a cosmonaut. He attempted to assassinate Gorbachev. Alexander Shmonov, the terrorist from Prostok-Vashino.
Высшее лицо же невозможно наказать с помощью суда, только террористическим актом, то есть местью за злодеяния.
On the night of February the 28th, 1953, Beria asked to see Stalin on urgent business. In the cabinet at his dacha, he said that he had damning proof against Nikita Khrushchev, who was allegedly preparing an attempt upon the leader's life. Stalin took an interest. Beria called an assistant with a folder containing secret documents. But before he'd put the papers in front of Stalin, the woman threw liquid in the leader's face. The General Secretary fainted. The woman injected him several times with a slow poison. The writer Yuri Mukin has no doubt that Stalin was poisoned. His evidence is based on medical investigations.
Значит, о том, что Сталин отравлен, я заявил, собственно говоря, первое еще в 2001 году в своей первой книге. Проанализировали лечебное дело Сталина, анализы, проконсультировались с врачами, нашли, что анализы крови показывают наличие яда в организме.
They have put Stalin to bed. The newspapers announced the grave condition of the leader's health.
Все говорят по-разному, по-своему, но суть остается одна. 30 часов Сталин лежал, ему не оказывали помощи. Причем все глухо скрывают лечащего врача Сталина.
Nobody knew the doctor. It was the same woman who had poisoned Stalin. Beria himself appointed her to look after the dying Stalin so that nobody could save him. It may well be so that she repeated the deadly injections.
Охрана, видимо, она уже начала паниковать. Охрана Сталина. И она вызвала сына Сталина. Уже Василий туда кричал: «Отравили отца, сволочь».
5 days later, Stalin is dead. His son Vasily was sure that his father had been killed. But nobody would listen to him. The point is that Lavrentiy Beria was not acting. His accomplices were several influential members of Politburo. and Nikita Khrushchev was among them. And after the death of the General Secretary, the main struggle for leadership began between Khrushchev and Beria. After Stalin's death, the former accomplices became rivals and bitter enemies. Each of them considered himself to be the worthy successor to the Kremlin throne, and Beria played up his involvement in Stalin's annihilation.
Берия в разговоре там с частными лицами, с Хрущевым, по-моему, сказал, ну что, вот, если бы не я, вот, я же ведь вас спас. Вот какие-то странные были такие намеки.
At the moment of Stalin's death, Beria was controlling the security service and the majority of the key ministries. This was a definite advantage over Khrushchev. To consolidate his position, Beria started the reforms and was the first to speak out against Stalin's illegal repressions. The members of Politburo were scared because it became clear that Beria would blame them for the mass repressions. It was the only way for the former NKVD chief to discharge himself. His comrades decided to remove the radical upstart. The conspiracy was led by Khrushchev.
Убийство Берии было организовано таким образом. Значит, президиуму ЦК было сообщено, что Берия организовывает вооруженный заговор, вооруженный захват. Для президиума, для того же Молотова-Кагановича, эти вещи были достаточно правдоподобны. И, видимо, Хрущев дает им это самое, что послать к Берии двух генералов с тем, чтобы они привели Берию на президиум, если он откажется приходить. Приезжают генералы и сообщают, Берия убит. Вот оказал сопротивление и убит. И Хрущев подбрасывает версию. Ну так, а заговор же не раскрыт. Давайте объявим, что мы его арестовали, потому что он организовал заговор. Ну, расследуем заговоры, это самое. И они принимают решение объявить, что Берия арестован и ведется следствие, т.д. и т.п. А Берия был убит.
So Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Just like Beria, he began after the dethronement of Stalin's personality cult. His fervor shocked the majority of the population. It hurt the people to see their ideals destroyed. And it was no surprise that Khrushchev's main enemies were ordinary people rather than comrades. Several students from Tbilisi University have taken the anti-Stalin campaign to heart. When they found out that Khrushchev was going to Tbilisi, they decided that Georgia should become his grave. They carefully planned his execution. One of them will stand to the right of Khrushchev's cortege and distract the guard by throwing a shell from the crowd. Meanwhile, the real killer will pelt the head of state with grenades. The Avengers went to a military unit to get some grenades and shells. They bribed a soldier to tell them all they needed for a lot of money. They hid the weapons on the outskirts of Tbilisi. They were terrified, but the young men were ready to do anything for the sake of justice. But then, the day before the state leader's arrival, they discovered that the military unit was out of ammunitions. The KGB of Georgia was urgently contacted. The night before Khrushchev's arrival, the students were already behind bars. They were liberated from the strict regime colony only after Brezhnev came to power. After Tbilisi, the authorities became paranoid about assassinations. Here's an example. Kiev, Ordzhonikid Street. Now it is Bankova 11. In the house of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Khrushchev was taking part in a conference of agricultural workers. Afterwards, he was heading for the cafeteria. The barmaid was cutting cheese to use in sandwiches. Suddenly, she saw Khrushchev enter the room. The woman rushed over to him with a kitchen knife still in her hand. The guards knocked the knife from her hands and pinned her to the floor. Later, an investigator asked her why a mother of two would want to kill Khrushchev. The barmaid explained that it was not her intention to kill him. She knew Nikita Sergeyevich from the time he was working in Kiev in the same building. She served him donuts and juice every day and just wanted to greet her former client. They didn't believe her and sent her to an asylum. She wasn't married, and so her children were sent to a children's home where they were registered under invented surnames. They didn't believe the barmaid's story because the whole country was unhappy with Khrushchev's policy. People were complaining about the absence of food in the shops, of exorbitant currency reforms, of high prices, and the failing economy. The ill-conceived army reforms led to patriotic soldiers venting their anger at Khrushchev. Khrushchev did not suspect there might be an attempt on his life. Ordinary citizens and members of the Kremlin elite were both dissatisfied by his policies. In the summer of 1964, the members of the Politburo were discussing Khrushchev's removal from power. The most radical of these was Leonid Brezhnev, who Nikita Sergeyevich had helped career-wise. Maybe we should remove him completely, insisted Brezhnev. Poison him, for example. But the plotters had dethroned Khrushchev without bloodshed and maiming. With support from the majority of the Central Committee members, they voted for his dismissal. When he arrived, the job was done.
Вот тут закончилась власть. Он приехал в Кремль, там уже шло заседание, достаточно мирно, да, скажем, вроде бы ничего такого не произошло. А все, Никита Сергеевич, вы уже никто. А если там я где-то выступлю? А если вы где-то выступите, Никита Сергеевич, что вы, конечно, можете сделать, то мы вынуждены будем опубликовать документы о том, как вы сами принимали участие в репрессиях на Украине, например. О том, как вы сами были ответственны за ликвидацию, скажем, деятелей коммунистической партии. И не просто за ликвидацию, а за убийство, которые вы лично инспектировали.
Khrushchev lived his last years on the dacha near Moscow under special services supervision. Brezhnev, who had become the leader of the Soviet Union, governed the state for 18 years. Only Stalin ruled for longer. He ended Khrushchev's experimentations, improved industry and food production. But he did not start any major reforms. On the contrary, he eradicated the beginnings of Khrushchev's democracy. Over time, dissatisfaction spread amongst the people. Those not satisfied with Brezhnev's politics began to riot. Among them was the junior lieutenant Vladimir Ilyin, who was serving in the army near Leningrad. His decision was maturing for a long time, but after the engagement of the Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia and the suppression of the Prague Spring, the junior lieutenant decided that there will be no democracy and no freedom under Brezhnev. It was time to save the Soviet country, to kill Brezhnev. Coming next, how the cosmonaut Beregovoy almost died because of his bushy eyebrows. The General Secretary Andropov was killed by an offended woman. The shocking confidence of the terrorist Shmonov. His regrets not killing Gorbachev.
Целился в голову, потому что, может быть, бронежилет у него одет. Жалею, что не удалось.
January the 21st, 1969. Ilin heard on the radio that the following day, Moscow was greeting the cosmonauts back from their flight. And he heard that Brezhnev would be there. That night, he stole 2 guns, some cartridges, and ran away from his military unit. Ilin arrived in Moscow on the morning of January 21st. He stayed with his uncle, who was a former policeman. The next morning, he put on the police uniform and prepared to carry out his act of terrorism. He entered the Kremlin without any problems and stopped near the Diamond Fund. "What are you standing here for?" a man asked sternly. "They have posted me here," said Ilin. The civilian left. Suddenly, Ilin saw a cavalcade of black cars entering the Kremlin. He recognized Brezhnev in the first Chaika. Or was it him? Ilin became excited. Yes, it looked just like him. The junior lieutenant withdrew 2 guns from his pocket and shot 16 bullets at the windscreen behind which Brezhnev was sitting. But the terrorist had got it wrong. The car contained the cosmonauts. One of them, the commander of the spaceship Soyuz 3, looked just like Brezhnev. The glass from the windscreen injured his face. Another cosmonaut, Andrei Nikolaev, had an injured shoulder. The elderly driver, Ilya Zarkov, was killed. The injured Nikolaev seized the wheel and parked the car. But where was the real Brezhnev? His guard had been informed the day before about an extraordinary event, the escape of an armed officer. Which is why the general's car left the government cortege and entered the Kremlin through another gate. Ilin was arrested on the spot and isolated in a mental hospital for 20 years. A sentry stood guard over him. In the late 70s, it became evident that Brezhnev would not be in power for long, and the General Secretary aspirants began a new life and death struggle for the throne. The youngest member of Politburo, Fyodor Kulakov, who was 60 years old, had a fair chance. But in 1978, he suddenly died from cardioplegia. The day before, his guard and doctor left his dacha. Somebody had made sure that there was no one available to save the pretender to the throne. The first secretary of the Central Committee of the Belarus Communist Party, Petro Mashirov, was popular in the state and was considered to be Brezhnev's natural successor. But in October 1980, he died in a road accident. A truck loaded with 5 tons of potatoes made way for the first car of the cortege on the Moscow-Minsk road. But then it blocked the way of Chaika, where Mashirov was sitting. The government limousine smashed into the truck at full speed. All the passengers were killed. There were rumors in the government lobby that the chief of KGB, Yuri Andropov, was behind these murders. He was not considered to be the main contender for the post of General Secretary, but he persistently continued with his aim, ignoring all the corpses. It was impossible to prove, but the death of politicians close to Brezhnev and the persecution of the General Secretary's relatives by the KGB subordinated to Andropov had to be more than just coincidence. The only rival Andropov failed to remove physically was Nikolai Shiolokov, the chief of another power department of the USSR, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Andropov demanded that Brezhnev dismiss Shiolokov. He was defending his protégé to the last. Only after Andropov became the head of state did he throw Shiolokov out of his job and ordered the KGB to investigate his corrupt activity. The former rival was going to suffer the penalty. But Shiolokov shot himself during the investigation. His wife had shot herself 6 months earlier. But before her death, she committed a reckless act which turned out to be fatal for Andropov. The wife of Shiolokov's Svetlana was trying to save her husband. On February 19, 1983, she launched an attack on her neighbor Andropov. A bullet injured the USSR leader's kidneys. This exacerbated a chronic disease which led to his death. Andropov had been head of state for only 1.5 years. In 1984, the state was headed by the extremely fragile Konstantin Chernenko. Before meetings of the Politburo, they would sit him in a chair and place a short speech in front of him. Then they asked the others to come in. Chernenko read with great difficulty the sentences written by his assistants. He ruled for about a year, even less time than Andropov. When the post of the General Secretary was taken by his successor Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was no longer a huge superpower. There was an ongoing crisis with General Secretaries being frequently replaced. Gorbachev's appointment as the General Secretary and his policy of perestroika split the state. Some were zealously supporting his reforms, others saw him as the enemy of communism. In 1987, inhabitant Teimuraz Kabahidze came to Moscow to kill Gorbachev. He had a homemade gun in his pocket. There was a demonstration in Krasnaya Square, and he got there through a column of workers. The terrorist saw the architect of perestroika greeting people from the tribune of the mausoleum. He was about to take out his gun, but it went off in his pocket. Kabahidze was badly injured. The assassination attempt failed. 3 years later, in the same Krasnaya Square, Gorbachev almost died again. There was a demonstration of workers on the anniversary of the October Revolution. The head of the state was standing on the tribune of the mausoleum as usual. Among those who Gorbachev was greeting was the resident of Polpino of Prostok-Vashino district, Leningrad region, Alexander Shmonov. He had a sawn-off shotgun hidden under his coat. The ordinary metalworker had been preparing for this day. In order to obtain his rifle license, he had been a member of the Hunters and Fishermen Association for 3 years and had been shooting at the targets every day. Alexander Shmonov talked openly about his secret operation.
Кто-то знал про ваши планы?
Ну, мы вдвоем были, значит, с человеком. Он с пистолетом. Его задача была ко мне никого не подпускать. А моя задача, значит, стрелять в Горбачева. Но он в последний момент передумал и прошел мимо вместе с колонной демонстрантов.
То есть вы поняли, что вы сами остались, да?
Да, я
все равно решили стрелять?
Ну, пришлось, да, все равно решил стрелять.
Shmonov took his weapon out in 12 seconds. He was an experienced shot, scoring bullseyes from 100 meters away. There were only 47 meters between him and Gorbachev. The terrorist from Prostok-Vashino took aim.
Достал ружье, снял с предохранителя, начал целиться в Горбачева, вот туда вот. Прицелился, начал нажимать спусковой крючок, и в этот момент ко мне подбежал сержант, схватил ружье, ружье дрогнуло, и пуля в высшем мавзолее пролетела.
Now, you're going to see the sensational attempt on a Soviet leader's life immortalized on tape. It was accidentally filmed by a camera operator of the film unit Darts. A policeman on point duty, Andrei Milnikov, jumped in front of the leader, saving the president's life. He grabbed the muzzle of the rifle and turned it away. The Jakan bullet, with improved penetrating power, flew over the mausoleum.
Еще бы, если на полсекунды позже подбежал ко мне этот сержант, то я думаю, успел бы выстрелить прицельно. Он целился в голову, потому что, может быть, бронежилет у него одет. Вот. Ну, жалею, что не удалось.
Shmonov was arrested and sent to a mental hospital for 4 years. After that, he was imprisoned in Lefortovo for a further year. Having been liberated, the ex-terrorist wrote a book about his unsuccessful attempt. Shmonov's act of terrorism resonated for years to come. His possessions are still in the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russian Federation Museum. For example, here is the coat he was wearing on that day. And this is the sawn-off rifle he used. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's comrades were plotting to remove the General Secretary in a different way. They did not poison him or hire a killer. They blocked the state leader in his dacha on Foros together with his family. The so-called putsch of Gukachev occurred in August 1991. But this last collective attempt upon the state leader undermined the Soviet Union. 4 months later, it collapsed. But the independent states which appeared after inherited some of the worst Soviet methods of problem solving.
Когда мы говорим действительно о большой власти, мы все равно говорим о большом риске, потому что там разреженный воздух. Там всегда можно получить и пулю в лоб, и отравленный пирожок, и отравленное письмо, и отравленного голубя, который случайно залетел в форточку.
The road accidents, the shots on the staircase, dioxin on the dacha, a suicide in his own house, a hunting accident. These are just the tip of a huge iceberg that is modern politics.